The sun hung heavy and white in the sky, bleaching the color from the world. It was June 21st, 1945, 14:20 hours, somewhere in the southern reaches of Okinawa, near the shattered village of Itaman. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, damp earth, and the faint, sickly, sweet odor of death that no one could ever quite get used to. Corporal Daniel Martinez of the 96th Infantry Division moved with the slow, deliberate caution of a man walking through a field of dormant landmines. His Thompson submachine gun, its metal stock pressed firmly against his shoulder, swept in a shallow arc ahead of him. His eyes, shadowed beneath the rim of his helmet, scanned the ruins. What had once been a fishing village was now a grotesque sculpture garden of war. Houses were reduced to skeletal frames of charred wood and shattered tile. Stone walls lay collapsed like fallen dominoes. The battle for Okinawa had been grinding on for nearly 3 months, a meat grinder of a campaign that had eclipsed all others in the Pacific for its sheer, unadulterated brutality. Every shadowed doorway, every pile of rubble, every standing fragment of a wall could be the last thing you ever saw, concealing a Japanese soldier prepared to die and take you with him. A sound. Faint, but distinct in a lull between the distant thump of artillery. Martinez froze, his body tensing. It came from behind a section of collapsed stone wall just ahead. It wasn't the controlled, shallow breathing of a soldier waiting in ambush. It was something else. Something that sounded disturbingly, unmistakably, like crying. He raised a clenched fist, signaling his squad to hold position. They fanned out, rifles up, covering the angles as Martinez approached the source of the sound. He moved carefully, each foot placed with precision to avoid crunching on debris, his Thompson raised and ready. The crying grew slightly louder, a muffled, hopeless sound. He took a final, silent step, pivoted, and peered around the edge of the broken wall. He found 2 Japanese soldiers crouched in the rubble, except they weren't soldiers. Not in any meaningful sense of the word. They were boys. One looked maybe 15. His face still soft with youth beneath the grime and terror. The other couldn't have been more than 14, small and fragile. They wore the drab, olive, green uniforms of the Imperial Japanese Army, but the garments hung off their thin frames like sacks, the sleeves of the younger one's jacket covering his hands. Both clutched Type 99 Arisoka rifles, the long, ungainly weapons looking absurdly oversized and heavy in their small, grimy hands. The older boy had a crude, filthy bandage wrapped around his left forearm, a dark, ominous stain of blood seeping through the cloth. Tears carved clean paths through the dirt on both their faces, dripping from their chins onto the dusty wool of their uniforms. When they saw Martinez, their eyes widened in sheer, animal panic. They scrambled to raise their rifles, the movements clumsy, unpracticed. The younger boy's hands shook so violently, the rifle barrel danced erratically, unable to find a target. Martinez's finger rested on the trigger of the Thompson. He could have fired. A short, controlled burst. 2 dead enemy combatants. He should have fired. Combat doctrine was clear, brutal, and born of bitter experience. Hesitation got you and your buddies killed. But something in him, something deep and primal, that hadn't yet been caroused over by the war, revolted. These weren't fanatical soldiers charging in a banzai attack. They were children. Terrified, crying children who looked like they barely knew which end of the rifle the bullet came out of. "Drop the weapons," Martinez shouted, his voice rough and loud in the quiet ruin. He knew they probably didn't understand the words, but he hoped his tone, the aggressive stance, the leveled Thompson, would communicate the message. "Put them down." Now, the boys stared at him, their eyes wide pools of black fear. They looked at each other, then down at their rifles, then back at Martinez. The older one whispered something in Japanese, his voice a choked, desperate thread. Martinez couldn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear from the context. They were deciding to die fighting, or to surrender and face what they believed was certain torture and a dishonorable death. The moment stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Then, with a shuddering sigh that seemed to deflate his entire small body, the older boy carefully, deliberately, laid his rifle on the ground. He nudged the younger one, who, after a moment of paralyzed indecision, did the same, the heavy weapon clattering against a piece of broken pottery. Their hands came up, trembling visibly. The younger boy began speaking, the words tumbling out in a rapid, sobbing stream. His voice was high, pleading. Martinez didn't need a translator. He'd heard that tone before, in the voices of wounded men calling for their mothers. The boy was begging, pleading for his life, reciting whatever propaganda he'd been fed about American barbarism. A cold knot tightened in Martinez's stomach. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the muzzle of his Thompson, pointing it at the ground. He made a calming gesture with his free hand, palm out. "It's okay, kid," he said, his voice dropping to a soft, low register. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The boys didn't understand the words, but they understood the action. They understood when he didn't shoot them. They understood when he called out, "Shen! Up here!" Got a wounded one. Private First Class James Chen. The squad's medic moved up, his aid bag slung over his shoulder. He took in the scene with a quick, professional glance. The two terrified children. Their surrendered weapons, the blood on the older boy's arm. "Jesus," Chen muttered under his breath. He looked at Martinez, a silent question in his eyes. Martinez gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Chen knelt beside the older boy, setting his bag down and opening it. The boy flinched back, his eyes wide with fresh terror, expecting a trick, a blow, the start of the torture he'd been promised. Chen ignored the reaction, his movements slow and deliberate. He spoke in a calm, steady murmur, the way one might talk to a spooked animal. "Easy now. Let's take a look at that arm. Gonna fix you up." He produced a pair of shears and carefully cut away the filthy, blood-caked bandage. Underneath, the wound was a nasty, inflamed gash. Probably from shrapnel. It needed cleaning and proper dressing. Chen worked with efficient, gentle hands, cleaning the wound with antiseptic, applying a clean white bandage from his own supplies. The boys watched, mesmerized and confused. The younger one's face, which had been a mask of terror, began to crumple. His composure, what little he had left, shattered completely. He collapsed to his knees, his body convulsing with sobs so intense they seemed to rack his entire small frame. It wasn't the crying of a child who'd skinned his knee. It was the sound of a soul breaking. The older boy, watching an American medic, a demon in his mythology, treat his wound with a skill and care he'd probably never seen, with supplies that were clean and modern and abundant, began to cry just as hard. Silent, shuddering tears that streamed down his face. These weren't tears of pain, or even of relief. They were tears of complete and utter psychological collapse. The shattering of every expectation, every belief, every ounce of conditioning they had been subjected to. Martinez watched them, these two enemy soldiers weeping in the rubble, and felt a hot, unexpected pressure behind his own eyes. He'd been in combat since late. He'd killed men in close quarters, seen his friends eviscerated by mortar rounds, felt the concussive blast of grenades, and developed the thick psychological armor necessary to function in the mechanized nightmare of modern warfare. But this act of basic human decency, this simple mercy, had stripped that armor away and left him naked before the raw, stupid horror of what this war had become. "Jesus Christ," Chen muttered again, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name as he finished securing the bandage. He looked from the weeping boys to Martinez. They're just kids, Danny. They're fucking babies. For those two Japanese boys, who had been taught to die for a divine emperor, and who believed capture meant a fate worse than death, that moment of mercy was a transformation more profound than any battlefield conversion. Everything they believed about enemies, about honor, about duty, about the very nature of reality, crumbled into dust in the face of an American medic gently treating a wound, and an American soldier offering a canteen of clean, cool water instead of the bullet they had been promised. The systematic sacrifice of youth was by June 1945 not an aberration but a policy for Imperial Japan. The nation had progressed from the tactical use of child soldiers to the systematic consumption of its own young in a desperate, fanatical attempt to delay the inevitable. The Volunteer Fighting Corps, the Student Mobilization, and various youth military organizations had drafted hundreds of thousands of teenagers into combat and support roles throughout the shrinking empire. The statistics, cold and bureaucratic, documented a nation cannibalizing its future. Approximately 250,000 to 300,000 Japanese boys aged 14 to 17 were mobilized for combat roles in 1944-45. On Okinawa specifically, an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 were deployed. Of those, approximately 5,000 to 7,000 would be killed, with another 3,000 to 4,000 wounded or captured by American forces. The average age of a captured Japanese child soldier was 15.8 years. An estimated 15 to 20% attempted suicide rather than surrender, and over 95% genuinely believed the Americans would execute or torture them. The child soldiers deployed to Okinawa had received minimal military training, often just 2 to 4 weeks of drill and weapons familiarization, but extensive ideological conditioning. They were taught that death in battle was glorious, that the emperor was a living god, that Americans were barbaric, subhuman demons, and that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, bringing eternal shame upon their families. Many carried cyanide capsules or grenades, specifically for suicide rather than capture. This psychological conditioning was so thorough that for those who were captured, survival itself became a cognitive crisis. They had spent weeks or months preparing themselves for death, accepting it as both inevitable and honorable. When Americans captured them alive and treated them with a humanity they had been taught was impossible, their mental frameworks shattered. The world was not working as they had been promised. Mercy from an enemy was not part of their conceptual universe. The Japanese military doctrine of total resistance in the war's final year demanded resistance to the death by all available personnel, explicitly including children and civilians. The concept of honorable surrender had been systematically erased from Japanese military culture, replaced by an ideology that demanded death over capture under any circumstances. This created an impossible tactical and moral landscape for the advancing American forces. How do you distinguish between a genuine child soldier who will fight to the death and a terrified child conscript forced into a uniform 2 sizes too big? How do you maintain combat effectiveness while trying not to kill children? How do you process the psychological burden of having to treat children as legitimate military targets? Through bitter experience on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and now Okinawa, American units had developed rough, ad hoc procedures for attempting to capture child soldiers when possible. They used Japanese, speaking interpreters to call for surrender, employed psychological operations that emphasized humane treatment, and trained soldiers to recognize the subtle signs that an armed child might be persuadable rather than fanatical. But these procedures often failed. Many Japanese child soldiers, driven by a potent cocktail of indoctrination and sheer terror, fought with determined ferocity, refusing surrender opportunities, fighting until they were killed, or pulling the pin on a grenade held to their own chests. The American soldiers who had to kill these children, even when it was militarily justified and legally sound, carried the images with them for the rest of their lives. The face of a teenage boy, contorted in fear or fanaticism, seen through the sights of an M1 Garand, became a ghost that haunted their dreams for decades. Assets. For the Japanese child soldiers who were captured alive, whether through wounds that prevented resistance, a moment of surrender under overwhelming psychological pressure, or simple exhaustion that made continued fighting impossible. The initial moments of American custody were a profound shock. Everything they had been taught predicted immediate torture and execution. Instead, they experienced a strange, disorienting ritual disarmament, a pat down for weapons, then medical treatment, sips of clean water from American canteens, sometimes a piece of hard candy or a cigarette. The contradiction between expectation and reality was so absolute that many initially assumed the American kindness was merely an elaborate prelude to a more refined and sadistic cruelty. 15-year-old Takashi Yamamoto, captured near Shuri Castle with shrapnel wounds to both legs, would later describe his mental state during his initial treatment. "I kept waiting for the torture to start," he recalled. "The American medic was bandaging my wounds, giving me water, even giving me morphine for the pain. I thought, this is a trick. They make me grateful, make me hopeful, and then they will hurt me worse." I couldn't understand why he was being kind. It made no sense based on everything I had been taught. I thought maybe I had died, and this was some strange afterlife. This psychological disorientation was compounded by their physical state. Many were severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from a host of tropical illnesses, even before their combat wounds. The combination of physical crisis and psychological whiplash created a vulnerability that made the American humane treatment particularly impactful. The moment of realization. The dawning, terrifying, liberating understanding that the mercy was genuine, that they were not going to be killed, often triggered the kind of complete emotional breakdown Martinez and Chen witnessed. Boys who had maintained a stoic composure through combat, capture, and the initial medical procedures would suddenly, upon this realization, begin to weep uncontrollably. The American combat medics treating these wounded Japanese children faced emotional and ethical challenges that far exceeded the already gruesome work of treating enemy casualties. These weren't just soldiers, they were kids, victims of a systematic betrayal by their own government. The treatment they provided often went beyond clinical necessity. Medics would speak in soft, calming tones, make reassuring gestures, and spend extra time trying to communicate safety through their manner, even when language barriers made words useless. Private First Class Robert Henderson, a medic with the 7th Division, who treated dozens of wounded Japanese child soldiers on Okinawa, wrote in a letter home, "Every time I treat a wounded Japanese kid, I think about my little brother back in Ohio." These could have been American kids in different circumstances. They didn't choose this war or the crazy ideology. They're just victims, being sacrificed by adults who should have known better. Treating their wounds feels like the only decent thing I can do in an indecent situation. The medics also faced the practical challenge that many of these children, still believing the propaganda, would initially refuse treatment, convinced it was a poison or the prelude to an experiment. The medics had to work slowly, demonstrating their good intentions through action, drinking from the canteen first, using the bandage on themselves, and sometimes physically restraining a panicking child for his own medical good. The universal language of medical care, the gentle application of a bandage, the relief of morphine, the coolness of clean water, often did more to break down barriers than any words could have. Our Cesar once processed, The Japanese child soldiers entered the American prisoner of war system, where the contradiction between propaganda and reality continued to deepen. Instead of the torture chambers and execution grounds they feared, they found organized, if austere, camps with systematic food distribution, dedicated medical facilities, and conditions that were, by the standards of the late war Japanese army, often superior to what they had known in their own ranks. The POD camps on Okinawa held a mixed population of captured Japanese personnel. From hardened combat veterans to impressed Korean laborers to these child soldiers. The younger prisoners were immediately obvious to the American guards and administrators, who made informal accommodations for their age and fragile state. Extra rations often found their way to the younger, severely malnourished boys. Medical attention was prioritized for those showing signs of trauma or severe illness. In some camps, the younger prisoners were informally separated from the older, hardline military personnel to prevent continued indoctrination and bullying. The American personnel, from the guards to the camp commanders, showed a particular, often unspoken, concern for the child prisoners' psychological welfare. The camps became unintended sanctuaries, spaces where these boys could finally, away from the immediate terror of combat and the iron discipline of the Japanese military, begin to process their experiences and re-evaluate everything they had been taught. 16-year-old Hiroshi Tanaka, captured after the fall of the Shuri Line, described his psychological transformation in the Pabu camp. For the first few days, I waited to die. I expected the Americans would kill us all once they had the time and opportunity. But the days passed, and we received food, better food than the Japanese army had given us for months. We received medical care. The guards were professional, not cruel. Slowly, I had to face the truth. Everything I had been taught about the Americans was lies. That realization was more painful, in a way, than my wounds. My whole world had been built on a lie. Despite the language barriers and the vast cultural chasm, American personnel and their Japanese child prisoners found small, human ways to communicate and build a fragile rapport. The universal experiences of youth, missing home, longing for family, a desire for safety, created a common ground where nationality and ideology began to fade. American GIs, many of them only a few years older than their prisoners, would teach them simple English words. The Japanese boys, in turn, would teach the Americans basic Japanese phrases, write kanji characters in the dirt, or explain cultural practices. These exchanges were simple, but they were profoundly meaningful, demonstrating that the enemy was made of people, not propaganda caricatures. The sharing of food became a powerful language of its own. American soldiers would offer Japanese child prisoners candy, gum, chocolate, or cigarettes from their own rations, or from care packages sent from home. These gifts were not merely material, they were tangible demonstrations of goodwill, evidence that the Americans saw them as human beings worthy of kindness, not as objects of hatred to be destroyed. This cultural bridge even extended to recreation. Guards would sometimes organize impromptu baseball games, teaching the Japanese boys the rules of America's pastime. They would play cards, using gestures and laughter to communicate. The Japanese children, raised to view Westerners as culturally inferior barbarians, discovered that the Americans had a sophisticated civilization with its own rich traditions of art, music, and sport. This exposure quietly but effectively challenged the racial superiority ideology that had been a cornerstone of Japanese militarism. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, who supervised a section of a POW camp that held many young prisoners, recalled, "At first, the Japanese kids were terrified of us. You could see it in their eyes. But gradually, they realized we weren't going to hurt them. Some of the braver ones started approaching the guards, trying to communicate, showing us photographs of their families. We'd show them pictures of our families, our girls back home. Despite the language barrier, we found common ground. We were all missing home. We were all tired of the war. We all wanted it to be over, so we could go back to being normal people, living normal lives. The extended time in POW custody allowed for the beginning of a long, slow process of psychological healing. Removed from the constant threat of death, provided with regular food and medical care, and treated with a basic level of decency, the traumatized minds of these children could begin the arduous task of recovery. Many suffered from severe nightmares, anxiety, and depression. American medical personnel, though limited in their resources and training for psychological trauma, did what they could. Mostly, the treatment was the environment itself: safety, stability, and time. The ideological deprogramming happened organically. It wasn't a formal re-education program, but a daily, lived experience. The constant, low-grade exposure to American guards and medics who treated them with decency, the observation of American organizational competence and material abundance, and conversations with other prisoners who had reached similar conclusions all contributed to the steady erosion of the propaganda's power. The process was not uniform. Some child soldiers remained fiercely committed to the imperial ideology, clinging to it as a life raft in a sea of cognitive dissonance. Others experienced a profound and painful existential crisis as their entire belief system collapsed. Most fell somewhere in between, gradually, reluctantly, acknowledging that they had been lied to, while struggling to construct a new understanding of the world and their place in it. 17-year-old Kenji Sato, who spent 4 months in American custody, described his psychological journey. The first month, I was too shocked and traumatized to think clearly. The second month, I began to question everything I had been taught. If the Americans weren't monsters, what else was false? The third month, I became angry. Angry at the Japanese military for lying to us, for sending us to die for nothing. The fourth month, I started to think about the future, about going home, and building a different kind of life than the one the war had prepared me for. The Americans treating me kindly didn't just save my life. In a way, they saved my humanity. So with Japan's surrender in August 1945, a new, complex question arose for American authorities. What was to be done with the captured Japanese child soldiers? They were, technically, prisoners of war who were to be repatriated to Japan. But they were also deeply traumatized children returning to a nation in ruins. The answer was a systematic, large-scale repatriation process. American personnel worked with emerging Japanese civilian authorities to identify families, locate surviving relatives, and facilitate reunifications where possible. For the orphaned child soldiers, those whose families had been killed in the bombing campaigns or the battle for Okinawa, the situation was more difficult. Some remained in American custody for a longer period, while social services were organized. Others were transferred to Japanese civilian authorities responsible for the legions of war orphans. The repatriation process was often emotionally charged. Bonds, however unlikely, had formed across the enemy lines. The American guards and medics who had cared for these boys for months felt a sense of responsibility and, in some cases, affection. Saying goodbye was an acknowledgement of a shared, terrible experience and the fragile humanity that had persisted within it. For the American soldiers like Daniel Martinez, the experience of encountering these child soldiers left a complicated and enduring legacy. They carried with them the memories of having had to fight children, of having killed some and saved others. They had been witnesses to the ultimate corruption of war, the sacrifice of the young by the old. Many struggled for the rest of their lives with a deep, seated guilt over the child soldiers they had been forced to kill, even when they knew, rationally, that it had been necessary for their own survival and the survival of their comrades. The image of a teenage face, seen through a rifle sight, became a ghost that haunted their quiet moments. Yet, for some, there was a measure of solace, a fragment of redemption, in the memory of those they had saved, those to whom they had shown mercy. The experience often shaped their post-war perspectives, making them advocates for peace. For international laws protecting children in conflict, and for the understanding that the enemy is rarely a monster, but often just another human being caught in the same terrible machine. 30 years later, in 1975, Daniel Martinez returned to Okinawa for the battle's anniversary. He walked through the now peaceful, rebuilt landscape of Itaman, the memories flooding back with a painful clarity. He was standing near a memorial, lost in thought, when a Japanese man, well-dressed and in his mid-40s, approached him. The man studied Martinez's face carefully, his own expression a mixture of curiosity and dawning recognition. He then bowed deeply, a formal, respectful gesture. "Excuse me," the man said in careful, accented English. "Are you Corporal Martinez?" "Daniel Martinez." Martinez, taken aback, nodded. "Yes, I was." The man's face broke into a warm, emotional smile. "I thought it was you. The years have passed, but I remember your eyes. You were younger. We all were." He bowed again. "I am Takeshi Yamamoto. You captured me near that broken wall. Your medic, Private Chen." He treated my arm. He held up his left forearm, showing a faint, white scar beneath his shirt cuff. "You gave me water and a piece of chocolate. You saved my life when the war said you could have killed me." Martinez was speechless. He stared at the man, trying to superimpose the face of the terrified, weeping 14-year-old boy over the composed, middle-aged man before him. The ghost of the past had suddenly been made flesh. You were just a kid." Martinez finally managed, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You shouldn't have been there, in that uniform. Your government, they betrayed you. They betrayed all of you. Sending children to fight." Takeshi Yamamoto nodded slowly. "They did. But you showed mercy. You did not have to. The war said you could kill me. Instead, you saved me." He paused, his own eyes glistening. "I have spent these 30 years trying to honor that mercy. By living a good life. By teaching my own children about peace. By remembering that even in the very worst moments, human beings can still choose compassion. Thank you, Corporal Martinez. Thank you for giving me the chance to live."